upper respiratory tract. And from the epiglottis downward up to the alveoli, it is known as lower respiratory tract. So we will discuss the pressures and volume changes and what pressures cause the inspiration and expiration, and which mechanism of breathing is active and what mechanism of breathing is passive phenomena. Passive phenomena. So the active and passive phenomena and the mechanics of breathing. Wherever there is change in pressure, the energy is always used. Energy is used. Whenever there is change in pressure, the energy is used. There are three diameters called vertical diameter and anterior-posterior diameter and the transverse diameter. The vertical diameter, in this diameter, the lungs upward from top to bottom, and this diameter is increased or decreased by the upward and downward movement of thoracic diaphragm, or also called thoracoabdominal diaphragm or abdominothoracic diaphragm. The primary muscle of the breathing is known as primary muscle of inspiration. Diaphragm is known as primary muscle of inspiration. So as the diaphragm moves up and downward, it increases the vertical diameter of the thoracic cavity. So as the vertical diameter is the most important diameter that causes lung inflation and deflation. So we will discuss the three diameters and the pressure changes. What pressure or changes are occurring during inspiration and expiration. This is the thoracic cavity showing the lung and three diameters. From top to bottom, it is known as vertical diameter. From side to side, from this cut rib cage to this cut rib cage, it is the transverse diameter. And another third one is the anteroposterior diameter from sternum to thoracic vertebrae backward. That is known as anteroposterior diameter. These two diameters are controlled. The diameter increase or decrease is controlled by the movement of muscles of inspiration and expiration. Remember, during quiet breathing, normal quiet breathing, when a person is sitting, the only inspiration is active process. It needs energy for muscle contraction, while expiration is a passive phenomena. And the stories of basic stories of two pressures, that is a pressure in the atmosphere and pressure in the lungs. If the intrapulmonary pressure is higher than atmospheric pressure, the air will leave the lungs. And if the intrapulmonary pressure is reduced by lung expansion, the atmospheric pressure, the lungs will be inflated with air coming from the atmospheric air. So breathing, pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation is the just inward and outward movement of air or breathing of air inside the lungs and exhaling the air outside the lungs. And this occurs because of lung expansion and contraction caused by muscle movement. Gas exchange between the air and the lung capillaries is known as the gas exchange, and this occurs to oxygenate the blood or to remove the carbon dioxide excess. So, and oxygen utilization by the mitochondria is a process of cellular respiration. It is a process of called cellular respiration. So this cellular respiration occurs at the level of mitochondria. the level of mitochondria. Here is shown a diagram showing the upward and downward movement of the diaphragm and the side-to-side movement of thoracic rib cage. What happens? Okay, what happens during inspiration? The ribs they flex out and upward, and diaphragm pulls downward. This causes a change negative intrathoracic pressure, and the air moves from the atmospheric to intrapulmonary space. The expiration, inspiration, and the expiration occurs in opposite direction. The ribs they extend outward and downward, and the diaphragm moves upward, and this causes the lung expansion, lung contraction, and the lungs are squeezed, so air moves outside.
Sir, can you
So
repeat,
this
please,
is
sir?
the story of mechanics of breathing, and the pressure changes, and the major role is played by the muscles and the diaphragm, and major diameter are three number called diameter, anterior-posterior diameter, and transverse diameter. Remember always these three diameters and pressures. In the next slide, I will tell you what pressures you have to remember. Thoracic cavity, the thoracic diaphragm is a sheet of striated muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. Above the thoracic diaphragm lies the lungs and the visceral organs, and below the diaphragm lie the gastrointestinal organs of gastrointestinal tract. So in this way, the thoracic cavity is divided into thoracic cavity proper that contains the lungs and the heart, and below it are the abdominal viscera. According to Boyle's law, the more the volume, the less the pressure of a gas, and this is known as the Boyle's law. As you know, what happens in inspiration? A decrease in intrapulmonary pressure occurs, and this intrapulmonary pressure is actually the intra-alveolar pressure. As it decreases below the atmospheric air pressure, the air goes inside, and when the intrapulmonary pressure increases above the atmospheric pressure, the air leaves the lungs. This is the story of two pressures. One is the atmospheric pressure present in the atmosphere and the air, and other is the intrapulmonary pressure. The true values I will show you in a separate diagram, and then you will realize what are the pressure differences between the lungs and atmosphere. Means the air moves inside and outside because of a difference in the pressures of intrapulmonary and pressure in the atmospheric air. So in case of expiration, the intrapulmonary pressure increases above the atmospheric pressure and air leaves the lungs. We will repeat this slide. Hello, we will repeat this slide of intrapulmonary pressure and atmospheric pressure. G. Very good. Shabas. Very good. Very good. Hello, are you listening?
Yes, sir.
Sound is not clear. Sound is clear. I am connected by a landline internet. Yes. So during inspiration, the intrapulmonary pressure is lower than atmospheric pressure, and the air moves inside the lungs. And during expiration, what happens? The intrapulmonary pressure increases more than atmospheric pressure, therefore air leaves the lungs. So this is the story of two most important pressure. One is known as intrapulmonary pressure and other is known as atmospheric pressure. Now what happens? There is another pressure force that lies between the two layers of pleura, two layers of pleura. One layer is known as visceral and other is known as parietal pleura. In between there is a potential space. This potential space has actually a negative pressure that keeps the lungs inflated and prevents the lungs collapse. Because lungs have a natural collapsing elasticity recoil power. The lungs have a lot of elastic tissue and this is always trying to collapse, and this is prevented by negative pressure surrounding the lung thoracic cavity. Lung thoracic cavity, lung pleural space. This pleural space actually lies in the space between visceral and parietal pleura, and it is a negative pressure. It keeps the lungs inflated and prevents the lung collapse. Normally, the lungs remain in contact with the chest wall, and lungs expand and contract along with the chest wall thoracic cavity. And as the diameters are increase or decrease, there is increase or decrease in intrapulmonary pressure, and this causes the movement of air. So intrapleural pressure is another pressure that is very important to prevent lung collapse and helps in lung elasticity, to neutralize the lung elasticity. So one pressure is the intrapulmonary pressure, other is the atmospheric pressure, and third is the intrapleural space pressure. Now the another terminology that is very important, it is known as lung compliance. Lung compliance is defined as the capacity of the lungs to stretch during inspiration. This stretch in positive terms or negative terms is actually the elastic tissue occurs because of elastic tissue present in the lungs, and hence lungs can stretch when under tension. And this elastic tissue elasticity, it is actually overcome by the negative intrapleural space pressure. Negative intrapleural space pressure. Negative intrapleural pressure. This negative intrapleural pressure is maintained by the two layers of the pleura. One is known as visceral and other is known as parietal pleura. So lung compliance is defined as the ability of the lungs to stretch during contraction. Ability of the lungs to stretch during the contraction. And elastic tissue is present in the lungs, and lungs can stretch when under tension. Another terminology that is very important in the lung mechanics is known as elasticity. Elasticity is defined as the ability of the lung to recoil to their original position when collapsed during expiration. This elasticity occurs because of elastin tissue present in the lungs. And this elasticity force, it is overcome by the negative intrapleural pressure. This is, it is overcome by the negative intrapleural pressure, elasticity. So lung compliance is the capacity of the lungs to stay during inspiration, while elasticity is the capability of the lungs to recoil to their original collapsed position during expiration. So any student, please repeat this slide. Ravi Raja. Hello, Ravi.
Yes, sir.
Please repeat this slide.
Sir, complaints is that when we inspire and we breathe, when we inhale the air, the lungs is stretched and elastic tissue present lungs,
Speak
which
loudly.
lungs can stretch when under tension, because when we inhale the air, the lungs will be stretched. That is called lungs compliance. And elasticity is that lungs to recoil to the original collapse shape during expiration.
Hello, Ravi.
Yes, sir.
Sound is very low.
तो जैसे आपकी ऐसी है.
Speak loudly so that Mubin can listen.
Yes, sir.
Hello, Adil Saleh. Hello.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Now, inspiration.
Hello. Hello.
Inspiration is
Hello?
an active process. It means the diaphragmatic contraction that utilizes energy. It increases the vertical diameter of the thoracic cavity, and vertical diameter increases the thoracic volume vertically. And another thing, important thing, is external intercostal also contract and expand the rib cage, increasing the thoracic volume laterally. That is the transverse diameter. This is the vertical diameter. This is the vertical diameter. So vertical diameter is increased, transverse diameter is increased, and anterior-posterior diameter is also increased. So this causes decrease in intrapulmonary pressure. Intrapulmonary pressure. So as the pressure decreases in the thoracic cavity and a decrease in intrapulmonary pressure lower than atmospheric pressure causes air inflow, and this is known as negative pressure breathing. This is known as negative pressure breathing because the intrapulmonary pressure lower than atmospheric pressure means it has become negative, and this is known as negative pressure breathing. Negative pressure breathing. Roll number 34. Any volunteer, please repeat this slide. Hello.
सर हमें कुछ भी समझ नहीं आ रहा.
Any other student? Ali Aswad 105.
सर समझ नहीं आ रहा सर. लेट आप अगर रिपीट कर दें तो उसके बाद मैं रिपीट कर देता
Very
हूँ.
nice.
एक बार समझा दें आप.
What happens during expiration? During expiration, due to elastic recoil of the lungs and a relaxation of the diaphragm and all other muscles of inspiration, as they are relaxed, the pressure in the lung alveoli becomes higher than the atmospheric pressure, and this causes the air to leave the lungs, and this occurs because of pressure difference. This occurs because of pressure difference. Pressure difference. Now remember, there is one volume of air called residual volume that always remains in the lungs. And this is known as residual volume, the volume of air that always remains in the lungs and does not allow the lungs to collapse, and it keeps all the time oxygenation of the blood. So this volume of air never leaves the lungs. Now, this is very important slide showing the pressure differences between quiet breathing and forced breathing. Between quiet breathing and forced breathing. During quiet breathing, the intrapulmonary pressure becomes 3 millimeter mercury less than pulmonary atmospheric pressure, and this causes inspiration. And if it becomes 3 plus 3 millimeter mercury, the expiration occurs. Now remember, during quiet breathing, the negative intrapulmonary pressure occurs because of muscle contraction, usually the diaphragm and other muscles, and this is known as pharyngeal. Don't make dry pharyngeal. This makes the chest to expand, and as the lungs are expanded, the
अभी बोला यार अपना माइक बंद करो.
यार ये क्या मतलब
inspiration
है भाई,
occurs.
माइक बंद
And
करो
when
यार.
the intrapulmonary pressure is increased, the expiration occurs in the same way. And
कंटिन्यू ड्राइव.
during forced breathing, the story is very different. What happens during forced breathing, the extra muscular effort and including the abdominal muscle, there is a increase or decrease of up to 20 to 30 millimeter mercury pressure. For example, forced breathing during exercise causes a decrease or increase of 20 to 30 millimeter mercury intrapulmonary pressure, and this causes excessive movement of air inside and outside the lungs. And as we know, during exercise, the respiratory rate decreases, and similarly, the air inflow and outflow is also increased. So during quiet breathing, the intrapulmonary pressure may decrease or increase by 3 millimeter mercury, and during expiration, this flow is very high, called the plus minus 20 to 30 millimeter mercury. Now, this is a very nice slide. The students should focus on this slide, and they should see what is the most important pressures that are causing inward and outward movement in the lungs. Now remember, atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeter mercury. 760 millimeter mercury. And pleural pressure, actually it decreases and increase by 4 millimeter mercury pressure difference. 4 millimeter mercury pressure difference. And this 4 millimeter mercury pressure difference causes a decrease in the atmospheric pressure comparatively of minus 4 millimeter mercury, and this millimeter mercury causes a net air inflow and inspiration occurs. And during expiration, a positive change in pressure occurs of 4 millimeter mercury pressure, and intrapulmonary pressure becomes 764 millimeter, and this is higher than the atmospheric pressure. And atmospheric pressure, if the intrapulmonary is higher, this will cause outflow of air or air movement going outside the lungs, and in this way a pressure difference, there is a actually a commitment between the pressures of atmospheric and intrapulmonary pressure. Now, there is one very important information. A person with the closed glottis and not breathing will have atmospheric pressure and intrapulmonary pressure similar to each other, and this causes no movement. So intrapulmonary pressure 760 millimeter mercury, atmospheric pressure 760 millimeter mercury. This causes no any change in the movement of air. So let us repeat this slide show. Mechanics of breathing. There is upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract. There are three important diameters. The vertical diameter is maintained low or high by the diaphragm or thoracic diaphragm. And anteroposterior diameter is increased or decreased by the muscles of inspiration or expiration. Similarly, the transverse diameter is also increased or decreased by the muscles of inspiration and expiration. Here are shown the three diameters. From side to side, it is a transverse diameter. From up to downward, it is known as vertical diameter. And from anterior to posterior is known as anteroposterior diameter. So if any person has a deformity in the skeleton, there will be abnormal chest diameters. Any chest deformity will cause a disturbance in the chest diameters. Remember, please. So these three diameters are for the normal lungs. During inspiration, look at this diagram. The ribs are flexed out and upward, and they move upward, and diaphragm is pulled downward. This causes negative intrapulmonary pressure, and intrapulmonary pressure, whenever it becomes negative, the air moves from atmospheric to inside the lungs. And this is known as inspiration. Inspiration. So inspiration occurs primarily because of muscles of inspiration called the diaphragm. Okay, diaphragm. The diaphragm is primary muscle of inspiration. Inspiration, remember two things, two pressures: atmospheric pressure and intrapulmonary pressure. When the atmospheric pressure is low than the atmospheric pressure, the air goes inside. And when the intrapulmonary pressure increases above the atmospheric pressure, the air leaves the lungs as occurs during expiration. So this is the story of two pressures called intrapulmonary pressure and atmospheric pressure. And beside these two pressure, there is another very important pressure, which is known as intrapleural pressure. Intrapleural pressure. This is the negative pressure present in the two layers of the visceral and platter pleurae, and this negative pressure is functional against the lung elastic recoil forces. Lung elastic recoil forces, which are generated by the elastic tissue present in the lung, and the lung tissue contains a lot of elastic tissue, and they are trying to collapse the lungs. This lung collapse is prevented by the negative intrapleural pressure. Any student, please repeat this negative intrapleural pressure and its importance against the lungs elastic recoil pressure. Any student? G. Hello, Mohammed Baksh. Mohammed Baksh. Hello. During inspiration, the intrapulmonary pressure will become negative. It is not always negative. It may be 0 or 1 millimeter mercury below the atmospheric pressure. Again, the air will leave. Okay. Mohammed Baksh, who will repeat this slide? Please repeat it. Any students who repeats it, this slide will get full marks in the Viva. G.
Sir,
If you repeat this slide, it means you are pass. Hello, Mohammed
Sir.
Baksh. Adil Saleh. Adil
Mechanism
Yes, sir.
of breathing, sir.
Come here.
It-
Hello.
सर ये इंट्राप्लूरल प्रेशर सर नेगेटिव प्रेशर होता है
शाबाश।
जो विसरल और पैराइटल प्लूरा
good.
के बीच में होता है और सर ये लंग्स को इन्फ्लेटेड रखता है और कोलैप्स होने से बचाता है.
Shabash. And lung collapse occurs because of which tissue present in the lungs? Elastic tissue.
टिश्यू.
इलास्टिक टिश्यू.
and this pressure is negative. Why it is negative?
Sir, due to elasticity, surface tension.
Elasticity, surface tension. No, why intrapleural pressure is negative? It is negative because of lymphatic pump. What? It is negative because of lymphatic pump present in this cavity, in this space. Means between the visceral and parietal pleura, the pressure is kept negative to prevent lung collapse and to overcome the elastic forces. And this negative pressure is maintained by lymphatic pump. Lymphatic pump. Hello, Adil Saleh. Hello.
Yes, yes, sir.
How the negative intrapleural pressure is maintained?
Sir, it is maintained by lymphatic pumps.
Shabas, lymphatic pump. And if you don't know the lymphatic pump, you should open the book. Student, please. Roll number. You understand? So
Okay,
there is
sir.
lymphatic pump present in the pleural space, that is the space between visceral and parietal pleura, and this keeps the fluid in negative direction, and all the time it causes sucking force that makes a negative pressure. This negative pressure overcomes the elastic recoil tendency of the lungs and prevents lung collapse and keeps it expanded. So this pressure, along with these two pressures, intrapulmonary and atmospheric pressure, they make the inspiration possible. So this diagram is very nice illustration showing the collapsing force of lung, -4 millimeter mercury. This is actually the negative intrapleural pressure. Negative intrapleural pressure. This negative pressure reduces the intrapulmonary pressure. If it becomes lower than the atmospheric pressure, the air is inhaled. And when this negative pressure becomes goes to positive direction, may become 0 or +1, then the lungs will try to contract and pressure will rise inside them, and it will be more than the atmospheric pressure, and air will be expired out. It will be exhaled out. So if you have any questions, please write down in the chat box. Hello, students. Questions? Hello, questions?
सर
E.
सर इंट्रापेलुलर प्रेशर में कौन सी चेंजेस होंगी वेरिएशन ड्यूरिंग
Sure.
इंस्पिरेशन एक्सपायरेशन
During inspiration, intrapulmonary pressure will become lower than atmospheric pressure, and this
सर इंट्राप्लूरल नॉट पल्मोनरी
intrapleural during inspiration, it may become up to 0 millimeter. Means its negativity may become more compared to expiration. Because during inspiration, the lungs are trying to expand, and intrapleural pressure will become less negative. Okay. Any student, please repeat this slide. Hello. Any student, please repeat this slide. Hello, students.
Sir, during quiet breath, intrapulmonary pressure is -3, and during forced breath, intrapulmonary pressure is 20 to 30 millimeter of mercury due to extra muscle contraction and including abdominal muscles.
Shabash. So this negative intrapulmonary pressure, and is because of negative or positive because of intrapleural pressure. Okay. So as the lung expands, the intrapleural pressure may become less negative or may be 0. The net force that causes inspiration or expiration is 0 to +1, 0 to -1 millimeter mercury intrapleural pressure. This is the normal range of pressure in the pleural space. +1, -1. And during exercise, it may become more negative or more positive. It may become more negative or more positive. Any question? Any question? It is
Sir,
time.
Question.
जी बताएं.
Sir, how important is atmospheric pressure for breathing?
This atmospheric pressure na. Actually, atmospheric pressure normally it is at an equilibrium position of 760 millimeter mercury. We are changing the pressure of the lungs, making it lower than atmospheric pressure or higher than atmospheric pressure. So we all the time are changing the lung pressure to inhale or exhale. We are not changing, we cannot change the atmospheric pressure. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Time for attendance.